Hello, it is time for another key question video, and this time it's chapter 27. So let's start with number one. What influenced the U.S. to expand beyond its borders and engage in imperialism? Well, first and foremost, you have the economic pressures, the fact that we have a lot of growing industry and business, but if you stay in your own country, you're limited in the amount of growth that you can achieve. So it is important to find new markets to expand to in order to continue the growth. So new markets is the first reason. Second would be Alfred T. Mahan and his book and The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. He alleges that we must, if we want to be a world power, we must expand our navy, increase our power in the seas, and that will allow us to grow. Some other influences include the fact that the U.S. wanted to expand its social and cultural effect. You have our religion, you have our history and our culture and democracy. All those provide reasons for us to expand beyond our borders and engage in imperialism. Number two, why did the U.S. annex Hawaii? The U.S. annexes Hawaii because, well, we had reached out to them as missionaries. We began Christianizing the Hawaiians early in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. After that, it was an economic relationship. We built some sugar plantations on the island. They trusted us so much they eventually gave us a naval base at Pearl Harbor. But why did we end up annexing them? Well, that was, again, economic reasons. We knew that we could get around the tariff issue if we had them as our territory, combined with the idea that we simply wanted more territory for more resources and control of those markets. And that's why we annexed Hawaii. Of course, Hawaiians did not want to be annexed by the United States, so Grover Cleveland blocks it. But once his presidency is over, McKinley goes ahead and annexes them. Number three, what were the causes of the Spanish-American War? I typically go over four major causes. First is the Spanish mistreatment of the Cubans. They refused to give them their independence and had been treating them quite cruelly. Combine that with our investment in Cuba and the fact that their revolution or the war between the Spanish and Cubans was destroying U.S. property and investments. Then you have Yellow Journalism by Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And their battle to sell more newspapers and to create sensational stories leads them to engage in propaganda, which is known as yellow journalism, and convince Americans that the Spanish are bad and evil and we must fight. So then we face with the fourth reason, which is the explosion of the USS Maine. When that ship explodes in the Cuban harbor, the American people rise up, influenced by that yellow journalism, to demand that we declare war on Spain. And so McKinley claims that he is coerced into declaring war, and America goes to war against them. So it's a very quick war, and so after the war ends, the U.S. has the choice of what to do with all the territories. Which brings us to number four. What territories did the U.S. gain from the war? First, we gain Guam, we gain Puerto Rico, and we also gain the Philippines, which we'll touch on in just a second. Cuba was guaranteed its independence by the Teller Amendment, although they are forced to adopt the Platt Amendment in their new constitution, which forces them to allow U.S. intervention should things not go the way America wants it to. The other territories, however, annex quickly, but there is a massive debate that arises when we try to annex the Philippines. The debate is based upon the idea that the Philippines don't want us there. I shared the document by Charles Sumner, which claimed that they hated our ways, they hated our customs, they hated our religion. They wanted to stay independent, but America ignored that. And if you remember, I showed you Albert Beveridge's reasons, and he said simply because of the resources and the market and the jobs that were available in the Philippines that could help the American economy grow. Then you have McKinley, and McKinley provided quite a unique look into, I guess you could say, almost American arrogance regarding its culture. He believed that we could not allow them their independence because they were unfit for civilization. We can't give them back to Spain because that was cowardly, and we can't give them to other European nations because they are our economic rivals. So the only choice was to take them over and annex them, to civilize and to Christianize them. So that shows our attitude toward the Philippines and toward other weaker nations, that we were there to be their parents. We talked about The White Man's Burden, a poem written by an Englishman, Rudyard Kipling. But when we look at the debate over annexation, you can see the American sentiment of superiority over other nations really standing out. One last note is the Anti-Imperialist League. People like Carnegie, Gompers, Jane Addams, and Grover Cleveland joined the Anti-Imperialist League to fight the annexation, but they are unsuccessful in stopping us from taking on the Philippines. Number 5, explain the open door policy. The open door policy is John Hay's attempt to get American inroads into the trade and markets in China. As Europe debated possibly colonizing the massive nation after the Boxer Rebellion, John Hay is able to convince them to simply share spheres of influence and to trade in each other's zones so that everyone could have economic growth and China could keep its sovereignty. Really, it was just a clever ruse to allow America in the door, the open door, if you will, to trade in that region where previously we had not had an economic foothold. Number 6, explains Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. To put it simply, Roosevelt wanted to use our might and our power, especially our naval power, to get our way. You could say that we were bullying weaker nations to get out of our way. So when you think about how he used big stick diplomacy, the greatest example is the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal should have been built earlier, but Colombia was holding out because they wanted a lot of money and a higher stake in the canal that would be built there. So Teddy Roosevelt supports independence of Panama against Colombia, and as Colombia prepares to invade Panama, he sends our warships down there not to fight, but to send the message that we are there to back Panama up, and any attempt by Colombia to take Panama back would be met with aggression. So the big stick diplomacy represents that America throws its weight around and intimidates weaker nations in getting our way. Of course, Roosevelt justifies it by saying what he does is positive for all of the world, but it still shows that America is willing to use that big stick, our massive navy, to get our way and bully smaller countries. Number 7, what was the purpose of the Roosevelt Corollary? Just like the Monroe Doctrine, the main purpose was to keep Europe out of the Western Hemisphere. Monroe Doctrine stated that they should stay in their hemisphere and we would defend ours. So the purpose of the Roosevelt Corollary was to add on to that, and we would take preemptive action. What we did is we would buy out the debts of weaker nations in Latin and Central America, and we would pay those debts off, and since those debts were now owed to us and not European nations, Europe would stay across the Atlantic Ocean, and we became the next door, I guess you could say, buddy, although quite frankly we were the debt collector for the region. Remember the political cartoon I showed you in class, which had the boats floating around in the Caribbean Sea? Teddy Roosevelt looked so happy with his massive stick and his little chain of naval ships. And that just shows you that America kept Europe out of our hemisphere while also putting ourselves in the position of power over the smaller, weaker countries around us. While there are some positives to the Roosevelt Corollary and the Monroe Doctrine, this is when Central American and Latin American nations really begin to dislike the big brother and big sister policies America had adopted. Number 8, what strained the relationship between the U.S. and Japan? Well, first, Roosevelt negotiates a peace between Japan and Russia. But the problem is that Japan doesn't love the deal, and they remain a little bit bitter that they did not get all that they wanted from those peace negotiations. Follow that up with what we call Oriental schools in California. California had begun sticking Korean, Chinese, and Japanese students together in schools that they called Oriental schools. The Japanese found this incredibly offensive, as they specifically chosen good representatives to be sent to America, and the fact that they would be being viewed as equal as their Asian neighbors. So as they begin threatening war, how did Roosevelt solve it? Well, there is the funny note that Roosevelt first sends the Great White Fleet to maybe intimidate, maybe show Japan that we meant business. Maybe it was a peacekeeping trip. Regardless, some historians believe that that was a message sent by Roosevelt to Japan. So Roosevelt actually solves it, however, by, after the Great White Fleet's visit, what we call the gentleman's agreement. He makes a closed doors agreement that is never written down in paper or shared anywhere, but we agree to stop sticking Japanese children in Oriental schools and to treat them, I suppose, more fairly and less discriminatory. Meanwhile, Japan agreed to limit the amount of immigrants that would be coming to America to limit the amount of conflict that they would face and create. So that is all for Chapter 27. There's some details you might want to look back over the notes for the upcoming quiz, but I hope that you learned a good bit from it, and as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to ask.